Today, we're looking at some of the greatest writers in history, both modern and traditional, and what we can learn from how they wrote. Not their prose, not their words, but their process. What gets these people in front of their computer or typewriter and telling the stories that we eventually read? And better yet, how can us non-full-time writers apply the tips and tricks to our own process? No matter who you are, beginner or advanced, published or not, there is something to get from this episode. Welcome to Writing Theory, a podcast for every level of writer. Everything that we discuss here on this podcast is about pushing you into the next level of storytelling. From prose to structure to business of writing, you can join me every Monday for a new episode, a new topic, and a new takeaway that you can apply right away. I'm Carson Long. Let's get started. Oh, we got a good one today. So today we're talking about a couple authors you might have heard of. We have Stephen King, we got Ernest Hemingway, Neil Gaiman, N.K. Jemisin, and of course yours truly, Carson Long. If you don't know who I am, I run a little YouTube channel on the YouTubes called Writing Theory, just like this podcast, where we have videos going out every Friday, teaching you about, cool things about writing, how to make your characters stronger, how do you get through that first draft, and every bit of advice that we go over on those videos is kind of like what you're going to experience here. There's just one difference. I have some ideas of videos, of content that I want to make that just doesn't quite translate to a video format very well. I just think it'll come off as like a little boring. There's like not a cool visual aspect to it. And for ideas that have that visual aspect, YouTube's the place. But there's still great discussions to be had right here, right now on the Writing Theory podcast. So let's talk about some writing routines. Now, I always find this really interesting, but I always approach this topic with a little bit of a grain of salt because all of these famous writers, when you hear about their routines, like, oh, I only write 10 paragraphs a day, or I write 600 words a day, not a word more, not a word less. The whole time I'm thinking like, yeah, but you've already made it. What about me? What about me? What's your advice for someone who hasn't made it, who's working another job, who has a family that they're being with? When you have all of these other responsibilities and you can't just say, I'm going to, who's that one author? There's some author out there who wakes up and runs a 10K every morning and then goes and writes. And I always forget their name. But, let's get to the people I do know the name of. We're starting with the granddaddy of horror fiction himself, Stephen King. Now, Stephen King has been pretty open with all of his own writing routines, especially with his 2010 book on writing. I think it was 2010, where we get a huge insight into just what the writing life is about. Now, of course, Stephen King books, I always gotta start the conversation with my favorite Stephen King books, and I'd love to hear yours. I am a sucker for Under the Dome. And I feel like not enough people talk about how good Under the Dome was. And I'm not talking about, the TV show adaptation, which I'm sure is also very cool, but the book Under the Dome was huge and it felt like every 100 pages you were getting something that was intense enough to be like the climax of someone else's book, but it was just like another passing scene of Stephen King's. We also have The Stand at 1,300 pages, which I read 1,200. Okay, let me back up. I read 900 pages of that book and then lost the book. And that's a horror novel all in itself. I'm not starting over, I'll tell you that. 11/22/63, the story of the JFK assassination, and fictionalized in a time travel way, is pretty fantastic. And oddly, and I know all the old heads of Stephen King are going to roll their eyes, he had this new book that came out just a year or two ago called Fairy Tale, that I thought was really interesting. You should definitely check it out. But let's talk about his writing routine that gave us all of those books. So Stephen King, very much open about his writing process. If you've never read On Writing, well, I got great news for you. Over on the YouTube channel, I have a writing book breakdown video, a series that I do, where I did a breakdown of On Writing to have all the good writing craft, writing life takeaways from that book. It's almost like a Spark Notes for the writing book. So you can always go check that out. Now, here's one thing I do respect about Stephen King is he's always been very clear in his like kind of decisive advice. A lot of people are hesitant to say, don't ever do this thing, never do that thing, always do this other thing. I am a big fan of that advice because I feel like a lot of other writing advice is very middling. Yeah, I do it this way, but you could do it that way, and maybe that'll work for you. Sometimes it's nice to just have someone be like, "Hey, here's the answer." So I try to I try to do that, but also, we're all learning along the way. That might change. But here's some advice that Stephen King has given in the past that's very decisive and divisive. For example, how many of you out there keep a journal of story ideas? Stephen King vehemently is against the story journal. I believe the quote that he says is like, when you have, it's like fishing with a net, right? You're trying to catch big fish, but you catch a lot of small fish along the way. And now it's your job to filter through them to find those fish big enough to cook up, those stories big enough and good enough to write. And you know what? I'm kind of with him. I know a lot of people in the Discord that we have are very much for the idea of a big story journal, keeping track of all the dreams and the ideas that you have. I believe a story that's worth writing is one that sticks in your head and doesn't go away. No journal needed. Now, Stephen King also has some other kind of rules that he follows, which is like, hey, I'm writing 2,000 words a day. That's it. And you know what? It's crazy because I feel like I'm pretty certain that's what the number is, but I see different sort of numbers quoted on different platforms, different websites in regards to this. But basically, it's like he's not writing, an absurd amount, especially when you consider how many books that go out. But Stephen King is writing every day. And that discipline pays dividends. We did a Novella November, kind of like a National Novel Writing Month spinoff with the Discord, and sitting down and pumping out 1,500, 2,000 words a day every weekday for a month left me with a 40,000 word story that didn't even feel hard to write. So discipline, you're going to see a lot of ideas about discipline coming up as we go through all these different writing routines. Stephen King also says if you don't have the time to read, you don't have the time to write. And before I had this YouTube channel, I didn't think that was divisive advice. The idea that you have to read a lot to be a writer. Stephen King puts it in a slightly different scope with the idea that if you don't read because you don't have time, then you probably don't have time to write as well. And you know what? Fair. Touché. Fair play. And then I found a lot of people not quite agreeing with the idea that you should read a lot in order to write. Like some people say, you don't have to. Of course, it'll make you'll think about stories more. You'll notice different prose things, but you don't have to write or you don't have to read in order to write. Yeah, that's crazy. I thought there was kind of only one mindset about that going forward, but I have been very much, my eyes have been opened. So here, I've actually gone through and I grabbed a bunch of quotes from Stephen King about his writing process. We're going to talk about them, and we're going to talk about how that's great for Stephen King as Stephen King. But what about us? What about the little guy and gals? What about all the people who don't have the luxury of this being really the main big endeavor that you're doing? So here's some quotes from Stephen King. We'll start with the first one, where Stephen King says, I believe the first draft of a book, even a long one, should take no more than 3 months, the length of a season. Any longer, and for me at least, the story begins to take an odd foreign feel, like a dispatch from the Romanian Department of Public Affairs. First off, who are you trying to impress, Stephen King? You don't have to whip out a Romanian Department of Foreign Affairs for us. We know you're Stephen King. You've already earned the respect. But I think this is kind of an interesting point. The fact that, there are a lot of people who are working on this story where, it's been their baby for so many years. But we're going to talk about it more at length at the end of the Stephen King section. But there's something to be said for setting some goalposts and working towards that and then being done with it. There's a whole other podcast episode that could be about choosing when to be done. And you better believe we'll get there. Another quote says, "If I don't write every day, the characters begin to stale off my mind. They begin to seem like characters instead of real people. The tale's narrative cutting edge starts to rust, and I begin to lose my hold on the story's plot and pace. Worst of all, the excitement of spinning something new begins to fade. The work starts to feel like work. And for most writers, that is the smooch of death." This is probably the most common theme you're going to see through all writing routines, is the fact that the importance of discipline in writing is, bar none, the most important thing to keep in mind. The longer you go without writing, the more your motivation wanes, the more your excitement to get back to the story wanes. During Novella November, when I was kind of like being forced to write every single weekday, it was so easy to dip back into the minds of those characters. And then I had family come and visit, as, life happens. It's going to happen to you. It's going to happen to me. I don't know if it happens to Stephen King. But as life kind of gets in the way, other responsibilities come up, and it's really hard to get back into that mindset. We'll talk about that a little bit more too. Another quote says, "It starts with this. Put your desk in the corner, and every time you sit down there to write, remind yourself why it isn't in the middle of the room. Life isn't a support system for art, it's the other way around." And I find this one really interesting from someone who has built a life from writing. I think it's kind of easy to say, hey, writing is what you do, not who you are. But it's also coming from a spot of you've already made it. You have that legacy. You have that story. You have the critical reception. You have the fans. It's easy to be other things are more important. But how many of us, and be honest with me here, how many of us are laying at night thinking about, oh man, if I could just get a little bit more time to write, if I could just get a little bit longer to focus on that story, that's what I need in order to sort of make this dream come true. It's easy to say when you've already made it that it's not that important. Something I've learned in having the YouTube channel is when you are steadily gaining subscribers, the subscriber count doesn't matter. And when it's totally stagnant, it matters a lot. The perspective, call it Einstein, call it relativity. The perspective changes how you look at every single thing in your life. So I don't know if you agree with us. Of course, I want to say life supports writing. Of course, I want to say that. But a lot of times we think that life gets in the way of writing, and it truly does feel like that. Let me know. Let me know what you think about that. So when it comes to Stephen King's writing routine, there's a couple takeaways that are sort of brought up time and time again. Of course, I've said it before, discipline. Also, he has a very dedicated space and time to write, lining up with that same discipline idea. But the dedicated space, he likens it to having a bed that you go to sleep in. The only thing you should be doing there is turning in at night and going to sleep. And you train your brain when you enter that space to prepare for bed. And the same thing for having a writing space, where the only thing that you do there is you write. And when you turn into that space, your brain gets prepared to write. And that is definitely something to keep in mind. That is something that we can apply ourselves as non-full-time, non-famous writers, is the fact that there are little tricks. There are little tricks to say, this is the place I go to write. This is the sanctuary. This is the place where when I enter it, I'm in that mood to write. And you can do that yourself by carving out that space and only using it for writing. I even have a dedicated writing laptop. I have a laptop that I use only for video stuff, and I have a laptop that I use only for writing stuff. And simply the having a different background image on that laptop, when I flip it open, there's only one thing I'm going to be doing on that laptop, and it's going to be writing. Those are little tricks you can absolutely apply to your own writing. So shout out Stephen King. Love ya. And the very last takeaway from Stephen King's thing is going to be consistency. Writing a book like It or The Stand or Under the Dome that's going to clock in at 1,300 pages is an endeavor that you can look at and be a little terrified or even, turned away from as a new writer. You can't write that story. That's only for the big boys, the big girls. That's only for the people who have figured everything out. I couldn't do that. Anytime you look at a big endeavor like that as its finished product, it's always going to feel way too much. But breaking it down to say, you know what, I'm going to write that story. It's just writing 2,000 words a day. I'm only going to look at that next 2,000 words. I'm only going to look at the next 100 words. I'm only going to look at the next scene. And then the discipline aspect of writing, which I said we're going to see so many times, turns those 100 words, that one scene, those 2,000 word days into those full novels that you can put out and be proud of. So Stephen King, I feel like kind of blazed the path for authors to be more open about their writing process. And that's something I'll always respect from him. And we see that again now with Brandon Sanderson, who is also very clear, very open about what it takes to be a writer, how he structures his schedule, things he like. There's so much content out there now for the budding writer. And we can kind of thank Stephen King for that. Let's go the other way. Let's go completely opposite of Stephen King. Let's go to our good old friend, Mr. Ernest Hemingway. Now, old Ernie. Old Ernie, wrote these kind of stories we're familiar with. The Old Man and the Sea, The Pearl. No, he didn't write The Pearl. Old Man and the Sea, Farewell to Arms, For Whom the Bell Tolls. The Pearl was John Steinbeck. How did that slip into the notes? Now, here's the deal with Hemingway. This is a different era of writer, right? This is almost like the Beat generation. This is the kind of writer who was traveling the world writing. That was their, writing was almost like a secondary kind of objective. Of course, they were going to be a writer, but, writing a story when you're inspired by living in Italy for a couple months is almost like a cheat code. Someone's playing on a different level than than what we can do. And we see that in a lot of writers from the era of Hemingway. And hey, look, love him or hate him, he had a very unique voice. I think this is kind of like academic writing in my mind, what you study in school. And there are plenty of people who like the classics and will pick up, The Old Man and the Sea for a good, fun read, or Farewell to Arms for a good, fun read. But the longer time goes on, the more traditional these seem, and I think the less of a modern audience these books generate. But there's always appreciation for that sort of academic writing. So what was Ernest Hemingway's writing routine? I pulled up some things. So this was in an era where the only content we got about Hemingway's writing routine was either firsthand through letters that he sent out to other people or observations for other people who were close to him talking about his routine. Our good old pal Ernie, do people call him that? Here's a quote. When I'm working on a book or a story, I write every morning as soon after first light as possible. There's no one to disturb you, and it's cool or cold, and you've come to your work and warm as you write. You read what you have written, and you always stop when you know what is going to happen next, and you go on from there. You write until you come to a place where you still have your juice and know what will happen next, and you stop and try to live through until the next day when you hit it again. You've started at 6 a.m, say, and you may go until noon or even through that. When you stop, you are as empty, and at the same time never empty, but filling, as when you have made love to someone you love. Nothing can hurt you, nothing can happen, nothing means anything until the next day when you do it again. It is the wait until the next day that is hard to get through. Old Ernie always had a very particular way of phrasing things around love. There's some really interesting bits here I want to focus on. We're again back at the concept of discipline, sitting down at the same time every day and putting in the time to write. What I think is more important here are two specific things. One, write into a place where you still know what's going to happen next. It can be really hard. It happens all the time because you write and you finish a chapter or a scene and you're like, bam, I did it. That's a great ending. Here's the twist. Here's the big conflict. We're into Act 2 or we're into Act 3. And you step away from the computer and you come back the next day and you sit down and you're like, wow, that was a really exciting thing I just wrote. What do I do now? So Hemingway says, of course, and it makes so much sense when you think about it, only stop where you know what's going to happen next. And I've seen similar writing advice around the web to this, which is, don't end your writing at the end of a chapter. End at the middle of a chapter, because it's so much easier to tell where you're going to go next. And in doing that, you kind of rev up. You get ready. And then when you hit that next chapter, after you finish half a chapter, you're warmed up. You're back in the story. And that is killer advice. Sometimes it's hard to walk away from the computer when you know what's going to happen next, which is why I think something like word count is maybe not the greatest way to judge, how successful your writing day was. I like the way that Hemingway says, write until you're satisfied. Write until you're kind of at the end of your motivation, your enjoyment, that you feel spent. Write until you feel spent is a great way to leave satisfied with the work that you've done. It's not, I left, but I didn't quite hit my 2,000 word goal. It's I wrote until I felt good about what I wrote. Trying to push past that could be a mistake. Stopping before that, you still need to get it out. Another quote says, he wrote standing up facing a chest-high bookshelf with a typewriter on top, and on top of that, a wooden reading board. First drafts were composed in pencil on onion skin typewriter paper laid slantwise across the board. When the work was going well, Hemingway would remove the board and shift to the typewriter, and he tracked his daily word output on a chart. So as to not kid myself, he said. When the writing wasn't going well, he would often knock off the fiction and answer letters, which gave him a welcome break from the awful responsibility of writing. Or as he sometimes called it, the responsibility of awful writing. What a good turn of phrase. Big thing here. And look, I think this is genius. The big thing here is that different writing impacts different parts of your brain, if that makes sense. And I don't know if you've noticed this, if you do different kinds of writing. Sometimes I'll be working on a story and I'm going to write until I feel satisfied. Maybe that ends up being 3,000 words. Maybe it's 5,000. Maybe it's 1,500. But what I found is I can switch to a different kind of writing, whether it's, writing an article for the Writing Theory website, whether it's doing some sort of post on the Discord, whether it's sending out emails. But my brain, sort of like I can rest the creative side of it and tackle something different. I've even found this applicable in writing two different stories at the same time. And it's not even something I recommend to a lot of people. The way I like to phrase it is, if you do want to work on multiple projects at a time, treat one as a job and treat the others as a hobby, right? Put in that time, put in the word count for the story that you're focused on. And then, at night, you got the TV on, you want to do some planning, you want to do some writing, you want to plot something out. Have fun with it. Give yourself the freedom to explore that, but always put that job first, if you know what I mean. So being able to switch up the kinds of writings that you do, whether it's the kinds of form, whether you're doing writing on a fiction story, then switching to emails, but also just being able to switch topics. You might be writing stories that are so different that you can say like, I'm totally spent writing this sci-fi story. Let me switch over to this cozy fantasy story, and it feels like a completely different thing. In doing that, I've been able to hit almost 10,000 words pretty frequently on days where I'm writing my book, but I'm also writing a script for a video or jotting notes down for a podcast. It is like another one of those cheat codes. And you know what? That's what we need. We need cheat codes for us part-time writers as well. Now, Hemingway was just like kind of a wild guy. If you've never heard of it, Hemingway, he lived in Italy for a while, in Paris, in Spain, in East Africa. He survived 2 almost like subsequent plane crashes in Africa, and even lived in Cuba for a little bit, where he bred 6-toed cats that are still alive at that house today. Insane. During World War II, I found this fact while I was looking at his writing routine. During World War II, Hemingway used his boat to search for German U-boats in the Caribbean waters. I think the boat was called Pilar. Was outfitted with communications gear, including HFDF or Huff Duff direction finding equipment, and he had a minimal armament, including a submachine gun and grenades. What? Are you kidding me? So you know what? he's one of those kind of writers that beat generation of writer where personality kind of overflowed and opportunity was insane. The fact that that he was able to bring, detection gear and machine guns and grenades with him. Probably, if I had to guess, probably sanctioned by some government or some authority. Is just crazy to me. But that was Hemingway. And take it or leave it. There's some advice you can apply to yourself. Neil Gaiman, author of, oh my God, so many stories. Neverwhere, Coraline, Good Omens, American Gods, Stardust. Oh my God, there's an insane amount of stories. Neil Gaiman is another author who, as of the past 20 years, has been pretty open about his writing process. And he does something that I think could be beneficial to a lot of writers who especially struggle with focusing on their writing. So, there's not one big direct quote I can pull here, but here's sort of the gist, right? At 1 p.m. every day, Neil Gaiman grabs a cup of tea, walks to the cabin in his back garden. That's very small, almost like a gazebo, and starts writing. And there isn't much inside of the shed. There's no phone signal. There's no tech. There's a few books and a desk. And he has an open notebook and his favorite fountain pens. And this is the place where he sits down and gives himself permission, where you don't have to write. You have permission to not write, but you don't have permission to do anything else. And then he writes or doesn't write for hours. Now, this sounds like hell to me. As someone who is I'm like that kind of person where it's I need that constant stimulation almost all the time. But Neil Gaiman, I think when you have that kind of mind where you get distracted so easily, and I'm sure there's dozens of us. I'm sure there's plenty of people who also find that struggle. There are ways to get some really useful distraction-free writing done. And if you can't have that discipline yourself to remove those distractions, there are other ways to have great distraction-free writing, right? When I used to travel for work out of college, I bought this thing called the Alpha Neo, I think is what it was called. And it was something that grade schoolers used to write in class, and is basically a keyboard and a teeny tiny little screen that only shows you 3 or 4 lines of text at a time. But this thing ran on AA batteries, and the only thing it could do is let you write and save that writing. You could have 3 stories on this little Alpha Neo thing. And that was it. That was the whole functionality of the device. But you could take it with you anywhere. The keyboard felt good to type on. Now there's a revival for these devices, and even a much more luxury market with the FreeWrite, I believe is what it's called, doing the exact same thing. But you can still find them for $50-$60 on eBay. I got mine before it got super popular again. So I paid $20 for my little typing keyboard thing. And you know what? I probably wrote something close to 35,000 words on that thing on a story. You just plug it in through USB, put those text files on your computer, and you have it. You don't have to be that extreme, though. You don't have to do that. There are totally other things you can pick up, even software you can use that are trying to give you that distraction-free writing. But you know what? You don't even have to spend a single dime. Putting yourself in a place where you can limit distractions is the first step to distraction-free writing. Whether that's just putting your phone down on a table across the room so it's not within arm's reach, whether that's writing on some bit of software that's not connected to the internet where you can just open up a tab and start looking at other things. There's steps you can take. And for a lot of us, those steps are really needed. But there's another thing that Neil Gaiman does in his writing routine that I think is really cool. And the second thing is free-form planning. Neil Gaiman gives himself a notebook and his favorite fountain pens. And you can go and look at, notes that he's taken for a lot of his stories. And those notes are all over the place. There's sketchings of characters. There's plot beats. There's things all scratched out. There's specific lines of dialogue. And the idea of free-form planning is one that maybe not enough people are trying out. Free-form planning is the idea that you don't plan a story just, in a on Microsoft Word or Google Docs where you're just jotting down an outline. Think back on the days of how even access to a sheet of paper or a whiteboard gave you the ability to go outside and beyond the borders of what you could do typing on a computer. And so there's definitely something there with when you're planning your next story, maybe take it off of the computer. Open up a journal, open up a notebook, go to Home Depot and get some, I think it was white melamine is what I got when I was in high school. Like a 4x8 sheet of white melamine. I had them cut it down to a size that could fit up where I taped it onto the wall in my bedroom. And I got some dry erase markers. And I had like this huge whiteboard that I would fill with teeny tiny writing as I planned out the stories I wanted to tell. And you know what? I bet that was some of the most creative story planning that maybe I've ever done. So there's something to be said for free form planning. Break out of the computer, find another way to get your ideas down. Let's talk N.K. Jemisin. Now, this is an author who I know has a bunch of books out, but the one series that I'm most familiar with is called Fifth Season. And this is a series that takes a lot of really interesting takes, not just for the story, but for the writing style as well. And the Fifth Season, that entire series, especially if I remember clearly the first book, the author uses first, second, and third person perspective for different characters, meaning the reading experience has you kind of like shaking your head like, whoa, what's happening now? But it's all done so well. Highly recommend it, especially if you want to study some really well done second person perspective. Now, N.K. Jemisin has a website where they themselves, write articles, and they did a great blog post about discussing their process of developing a story. So here are some notes I pulled out of a very long blog post talking about this writing process, because I think these routines are specifically things you can apply yourself as well. Quote, "The moment the idea stops being just a vague thought exercise and suddenly captivates me enough to want to write a book, that's the first step. But the idea is only the beginning, and they can usually tell right off whether an idea was a short story length or novel length. Then they write an initial synopsis, write down a general gist of the idea. The final idea is always very, very different. Then they write a first chapter. It doesn't really matter that there's no plot at the stage, but basically you're trying to get a feel for the viewpoint, character, and the voice of the story. Then they write the first chapter again, usually from a different character's point of view or in a different person or tense or a different style, and they just keep writing first chapters until they find one that feels right. And then something that they've done since they had an agent was they write the first 100 pages and then send them to the agent and basically go, huh? And the agent tells what the agent thinks. And they usually pair this treatment with, here's an outline so you can sort of extrapolate what's going to happen next, and a more comprehensive synopsis of the story. And they send those to a writing group, a set of friends, other writers, story lovers, to kind of give feedback on the idea of the story. Now, I just put out a video last month about beta reading, alpha, beta, and gamma reading, technically. And this is kind of an idea similar to that. If you've never understood the difference, I only ever really heard about beta readers, but alpha readers come in even before you've really refined your story and just give you feedback based on the overall direction and structure of the story. Beta readers give you editing advice when you've kind of run out of editing you can do yourself. And gamma readers come in at the final draft state to just be like, hey, you missed this typo. So there's you could go watch my 14-minute video, which is so good. It's a good video. Or you could just take that information. Am I sabotaging my content creation career? But here's the deal. I pulled this stuff out specifically. I looked at a bunch of authors. I pulled this one out because I thought there were two very, very important points here. The first being, not every word that you write for your story needs to be in efforts of finishing the draft. I feel like N.K. Jemisin does this thing, for lack of a better word, I'm going to call exploratory writing. Just trying things out and kind of, allowing themselves to write words that's, maybe it's not the most, quote, optimal, to write a 4 or 5,000 word opening chapter that you're never going to use, but it helps you figure out your story better. And in fact, I'm working on a fantasy epic right now that has a big cast of characters, and I thought they were all so interesting. So what I did was I wrote sort of like a short story or a scene or like an origin story for each character to sort of feel who was the most interesting, who brings the most to the story. And now I'm going to adjust my plot to reflect those characters and their journeys better. And that's my perspective characters, not this. I wasn't ever going to have 5 or 6 different perspective characters. That's not my jam, but I would have 3, and I want to make sure they're the 3 best characters I can put together. So that sort of exploratory writing really opened my eyes about what I could do. And breaking out of the mindset of like, anytime that I write, I want it to be like in efforts to get my story closer to the end. That's not always the case. I found that exploratory writing to be really useful, and I think N.K. Jemisin phrases it so well. Now, I know this one was more about, less about the routine of like sitting down in front of the computer and writing, but I also thought this perspective was a good one to bring in here because it's more than just sitting in front of the computer. It's, how you treat your story is, some people will treat it like this very reverent thing. Some people would treat it like it's art that needs to be made. And other people would treat it like, I'm going to write this and no one will ever see it. I think you should go into it just having the most fun that you can, write the best story that you can, and I think you should share it. Hot take, controversial opinion, you should definitely share your story. If you're ever interested in self-publishing, figuring out what goes into all of that, there's tons of great content on the Writing Theory YouTube channel. So let me tell you about my process. Now, here's the thing, though. I'm coming from a perspective of someone who has self-published a book, but also someone who hasn't figured everything out. But I have tried a lot of things and slowly been refining what works for me as I go through this process. And this is one of the great things, is like every time you sit down and write, every time you start a new project, every time you start a project or finish a project, you are learning more about what works for you. There is no such thing as a failed project when it comes to writing. Even if you start a story, jot down 20,000 words, which is an accomplishment, and you don't finish that story, you've figured out what you need to do to get 20,000 words down. And you've also figured out what went wrong where maybe you didn't feel like finishing it. Why was that? Maybe there's something you can change about your process that'll take you all the way next time. So I've written one book that I've released called Starlight Farms Kennel for Talking Dogs. And over November, I started Upon Careless Gray Hills, a thriller set in a small town in Alaska. And for Starlight Farms, this was born out of me putting a plot together in a plot framework, very like cut and dry. Here is Act 1. Here's everything that needs to happen in Act 1. Here is Act 2. Here's every single thing that needs to happen in Act 2. Here's Act 3. Here's every single thing that needs to happen in Act 3. I have a 4-part series where I talk about all of this. You can go check it out. And a live stream where I break down the book of the things I liked about it and the things I didn't like about it. That's a good thing about finding a content creator is that they create a bunch of content. Hey, who would have thought? Now, Careless Gray Hills, this thriller set in Alaska, was less structured. It had less of, plot beats that needed to happen. And as I found out, it was way more character driven in terms of like losing myself in the characters and letting them explore their relationships with other characters and building conflict and building tension and building moments of setup and resolution between the characters. It all came out so much more naturally than Starlight Farms. And that's the idea of, plotting a story versus pantsing your way through a story, discovery writing. And you know what? Here's what I'll say. Having now done both of these, and Upon Careless Gray Hills is still in progress. I'm about 50-something thousand words in. When it comes to planning a story, first off, planning a story is so much damn fun. You should be having fun planning a story. When you plan a story, the potential for that story is like through the freaking roof, right? You're thinking of all the twists and the great moments and the cool world, maybe the magic system, maybe the character betrayals, all of these things, and it is so much fun. When I plan a story, I'm typically doing what I call passive planning. And I don't know about you, I very rarely sit down and start writing planning stuff about my story. Instead, I might spend a month or two just kind of like passively thinking up interesting ideas and like asking my question of like, well, what would happen if this thing happened? What if I changed my character like this? And I never write a single thing down. Again, going back to that Stephen King idea, like the big ideas, the good ideas stick with you. If you write every single thing down, now you just have to filter through a whole bunch of stuff. And you can feel differently about that, but that's how I do it. And I consider planning a book in this way, and even jotting down, character stuff or writing a scene from a character to figure out who I want to tell the story through. I consider all of this to be a hobby. And I consider the actual act of sitting down and writing my story to be like that disciplined job. And yeah, look, life still gets in the way. I have my ups and downs just like everyone, but I take it way more seriously than I do planning a story. I put in the time to do that writing, and then afterwards, when I'm doing other things, when I have extra time, I'm sitting down playing a video game, I might stop and be like, you know what? What if I went down and I, started trying to put images to each one of my characters? What if I started, working on character descriptions or, all of that stuff is like the things I could do for fun. Now, when you actually sit down and write, my writing routine has really evolved because I initially used to only be able to write by sitting down in seclusion with noise-canceling headphones, lo-fi music on. Me and my wife even built an entire shed in our backyard that's specifically like a writing space, and I freaking love that place. But I've also realized that relying on seclusion and noise-canceling headphones for me to get my story down was probably not the best way to go about it. I put a lot of value over the past 2 years to change how I go about writing, where I don't rely on that seclusion, where I don't rely on having noise-canceling headphones, even though I still typically do. But in fact, learning that or trying to teach myself that writing needs to be something I can do without any barriers, because every little barrier adds up. If you can only write at the cafe, and that cafe is closed on Sundays, are you ever going to write on Sunday? If you can only write while listening to lo-fi music with noise-canceling headphones, what if you leave them somewhere on accident? Will you ever be able to write without them? You need to break down those barriers if you want to be someone who can write when it's time to write. And, just like how there's discipline in things like sitting down each day and writing, there's also discipline in you for being able to put your mind into that state of focus and doing that writing. So I realized my time was better spent training myself to be able to write in non-ideal situations and then enjoying the ideal situations when they come up. And now it means I can write whenever I want to write. Now, my current writing process is I mainly just write on Thursdays and Fridays, and I get about 5,000 to 7,000 words a day. Sometimes I can dip down to 2,000, but I'm usually writing for 3 or 4 hours on those Thursdays and Fridays. And I can make some good progress. And that means like 10,000 words a week. Hey, you know what? 8 weeks, you have a full book. In my writing process, I use Scrivener as my software of choice. I just found it works for me. It's how I organize thoughts in my head. I could be laying down on the couch writing. I could be in my filming room where I do all my videos. I could be on my desktop PC writing and, just bringing my laptop in there to another room and writing. I still do like to have lo-fi music. I would love to see some sort of study about what types of music lead to more creative endeavors or more focused time. I'm sure it's out there. And then I write until I feel drained, and that tends to happen around 5,000 words. And let me tell you, life still gets in the way, and that's nothing to be ashamed of. You have family coming to visit. I'm not going to ignore family just so I'm writing. If I, am not feeling well, I'm not going to put myself in a situation where I'm not feeling well and struggling to probably write something that's not as good. If I'm sick, take some time off, all those sort of like things where life gets in the way. Like you try to have the discipline, but the hardest, maybe look at it this way. You are disciplining yourself to practice getting back into the routine, because getting back into a routine is almost harder than anything else. The good news is you can follow my writing process as it evolves over on the YouTube channel, Writing Theory. Link in the show notes if you want to check that out. And hey, you know what? The kind of content that's going on here, I think, is just as useful in growing and being a stronger writer than what I'm posting over on the YouTube channel. It just means we get to chat. It means I don't have to worry about trying to get graphics on the screen or some sort of visual gag to keep your attention. Podcasts, I think, have a very great place, a great role to play in you being interested in something and getting more information about it. If you want to see this podcast succeed, then let me know that you're listening. And the very best thing that you can do to support more writing content, not even just this podcast, but writing content, is to rate this podcast on whatever platform that you're using and show your support. And again, you can check out every single Monday for more videos, more writing content, us growing as writers, being better, being stronger, being faster writers, being more intentional writers. I don't know what your goals are, but you know what? I'm here to help you. I'm here to help you get to them. With all that being said, thanks for checking out the podcast. This is just episode number 1, and we have a long way to go for the next episodes. So I hope to see you along the way. Feel free to hop down into our Discord using the link in the show notes and come say hi. We have a whole chat there just for the podcast that you can check out as well. So I'll see you next Monday. Get some writing done, and good luck out there.